What if the biblical Mount of Olives is at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City? Let's get into it. Okay, I want to preface this by saying that it's probably not going to make a lot of sense if you don't have context. So if you're new here, you may want to go back and watch some of my other videos to get some context for where I'm coming from with this. So first, we're going to look at what the Bible has to say about the Mount of Olives. It actually has some pretty exquisite detail about the location of the Mount of Olives. So according to scripture, we know that the Mount of Olives is east of Jerusalem. It's elevated, obviously. It's just outside the city limits, yet it's still close enough to be, that's actually a typo up there. Let me move my head. It's close enough to be within a Sabbath day's journey from Jerusalem, which experts say is anywhere from half a mile to 1 mile. Sabbath day's journey is how far they were allowed to walk on the Sabbath without breaking the Sabbath. Another important piece of information is that in John, it says that Jesus and his disciples crossed the Kidron from Jerusalem to go to Gethsemane. And then in Mark and Matthew, it says that Gethsemane was on the Mount of Olives. And since we know the Mount of Olives is east of the city, also Gethsemane is east of the city across the Kidron. So let's look at the map. I know this could be a little hard to see, but you can look at this for yourself on Google Earth. If you go to the link in my bio, I have my map I'm working on building out with all the locations as I learn about it. So you can go look at that there if you want a better view. But let me get my pointer out. So this blue line here is the Kidron. There's the upper branch and the lower branch. Jerusalem is, as we have established, Salt Lake City. Temple Mount is up there where it says temple. The Garden of Gethsemane, the cross and the tomb, are right up here at this blue dot. And then over here to the side is where the Mount of Olives is. So you can see this matches what scripture says. If they were in Jerusalem, they crossed the Kidron. They went out of the city so that would put the edge of the city right here, the city boundaries. Gethsemane is here, which is at the base of the Mount of Olives, and I'll show you this in a minute, but this is the base of the Mount of Olives, and you go up the hill, and the University of Utah is right there at the top. So here are some images looking down from the top of the Mount of Olives. Here's another one looking down at the city. This is on University Boulevard. So you can see how it kind of steeply drops there as you go down the hill. Here's a really good picture. So this puts in perspective how big and steep the Mount of Olives is. So this view you're looking down at is where the Kidron Valley and like downtown Salt Lake City, the temple, and then going a little further to the Jordan River is. So from this view, you're up on top of the mount and you're looking down to where the general area of the temple would have been. So when I first started looking into this, I was a little bit confused because I think in my head I was imagining the Mount of Olives as like a big mountain, like with peaks. But the Hebrew word used for mount in the Bible, which is har, can also mean hill or hill country. And I think that hill I just showed you more than qualifies. In most areas, it would be considered a mountain, but because it's up against the massive mountain range there, it seems small in comparison. But har can mean a mountain, a range of hills, hill or hill country, mount or mountain. And it is used frequently in the Bible to talk about both hills, hill country, people from the hill country, and mountains, both. So I pulled up an elevations map. This white line is kind of the parameter of Mount of Olives, very roughly. But these lines here are elevation lines. So the closer the lines are together, the steeper the elevation is. So you can see down here at the base is around where the Garden of Gethsemane is. This up here, there's actually a place called Mount Olivet Cemetery, which is close to the top of the hill. And then up here is where the University of Utah is, right in here. And you can see how the lines get further apart up here on top of the hill. So it kind of plateaus off and goes steeply up where all these lines are really close together. And then it plateaus off and gets a little flatter up there at the top. So here is where the Garden of Gethsemane is. You see it's kind of at the base of the hill, and it goes a really steep incline up and comes up to the Mount Olivet Cemetery, which is closer to the top. And then from Mount Olivet Cemetery up to the top of the hill, which is where the University of Utah is, and also historic Fort Douglas is up here on the hill as well. Sorry, I can't get my finger to point where I want it to. And this is just kind of an interesting tidbit, but when Fort Douglas was there, they used water from Immigration Creek, which is the big creek that runs out of the mountains right there. You can kind of see it on the map. But they used that to irrigate their fields and crops at Fort Douglas. So in my mind, that would make a lot of sense if the olive groves were up on the top of the mount, because you wouldn't be planting them necessarily on the steep part of the hill. Maybe they did, but it makes sense to me they'd be more on the top, and then they could irrigate those groves with the water from Immigration Creek, just like they did when Fort Douglas was there. Just an interesting tidbit. But from the top of the hill where Fort Douglas is about 5,000 feet above sea level. And it drops down to about 4,200 feet above sea level down at the base of the mount, closer to where the Garden of Gethsemane is. So that's a rise of almost 800 feet, which is pretty significant, very big hill. And then distance-wise, it also lines up perfectly. Remove my talking head, but you can see down there where I drew that line from the Garden of Gethsemane up to Mount Olivet Cemetery is about 3/4 of a mile. So depending on where you started drawing the line, if you kind of started at the edge of Jerusalem and went up the hill, or if you started a little bit closer to the Kidron Valley and went to the base of the hill, it still lines up. It's right within that 1/2 mile to 1 mile distance range as described in the Bible. So it fits that description distance-wise perfectly. And then obviously they grew olives on the Mount of Olives. Currently there aren't olives grown in Salt Lake City because the winters are much too cold. But there are other varieties of wild olives that grow profusely in the area. One is the Russian olive, although it's not necessarily considered native to the area, but there are other varieties of native olive plants that grow in the area, the desert olive and the wild olive, and there's a couple other ones as well. They're not necessarily considered primary food sources. However, they're a little more medicinal. They are edible, but people make jams and jellies and make tinctures and things like that. So it's possible they could have grown something like that there, but I think the more likely scenario is that in biblical times there was a massive inland sea to the west of Jerusalem or the west of Salt Lake City. But depending on the time frame and the maps you look at, the location of this lake varies a little bit. But what happened, basically the entire Great Basin was a massive inland lake. There was a natural dam in Idaho that supposedly gave way, and all the water drained out over a series of different events over a period of time. Here is another artistic rendition of what that possibly could have looked like. Again, there's a lot of information. It kind of depends on where you look, where the exact parameters are, depending on the exact time frame and history you're looking at. But since Salt Lake City is up against this mountain range, it would make a lot of sense that because there's this great inland sea, that this area would have been much more temperate than it is now, and the winters would have been much more mild, and it would have actually been a perfect area for growing olives. In the Bible, this sea would be what's equivalent to the Mediterranean Sea in the Middle East, but in the Bible it's called the Hinder Sea, the Western Sea, and the Sea of the Philistines. And there are cold, hardy variations of olives that are grown as far north as Canada in some areas. So it's not hard to imagine that this area at one point in time was very conducive to that type of crop. If you've not seen my video on the Garden of Gethsemane, it's in my pinned videos, so I recommend you go check that out. But drop your comments and your questions down below, and I'll do my best to answer them.